Cowboy shared water with a native boy. At sunrise, tribes gathered in peace. The relentless summer sun beat down on the parched Wyoming territory, turning the landscape into a canvas of gold and amber. Thomas Miller wiped the sweat from his brow with a bandana that had once been red but was now faded to a dusty pink from years of similar gestures. The 32-year-old cowboy had been driving cattle along the eastern foothills of the Wind River Range for nearly a decade, but this season's drought was testing even his weathered resolve. "Easy now," he murmured to his chestnut mare, Penny, as she stepped carefully along the rocky trail. The small herd of cattle trudged ahead, their movements sluggish in the oppressive heat. Behind him rode two younger cowboys, brothers Elijah and Samuel Hayes, hired hands who had joined his outfit the previous spring. "Tom," called Elijah, spurring his horse forward to catch up. "Water's running lower than expected. We've got maybe 2 days' worth at this pace, not the 4 we planned on." Thomas frowned beneath the wide brim of his hat. The creek they had counted on for resupply was likely to be dry if the rest of the landscape was any indication. They were still 3 days from the trading post at Green River, where they planned to sell half the herd before continuing north. "We'll have to find another source," Thomas said, scanning the horizon. "There's supposed to be a spring near the base of those hills to the west. Might mean adding half a day to our journey." Samuel, the more cautious of the brothers, pulled alongside them. "That's Shoshone territory, ain't it?" His voice carried the edge of concern that had become common among settlers and cowboys since tensions had flared between local tribes and the military the previous autumn. Thomas nodded slowly. "It is, but I've traded with them before. Fair people if you treat them with respect." He didn't add that his last interaction had been nearly 3 years ago, before the treaties had been broken and redrawn to further diminish tribal lands. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas made the decision to adjust their course toward the western hills. They made camp as the sun began its descent, the cattle settling into an uneasy rest, instinctively aware of the water shortage. The night was clear, stars emerging like pinpricks in the deepening blue canvas above. "I'll take first watch," Thomas told the brothers as they finished their meager supper of beans and hardtack. "We'll head out at first light." The night passed without incident, but sleep came fitfully to Thomas. His dreams were filled with flowing streams that dried up as soon as he reached them, leaving nothing but cracked earth beneath his fingers. Dawn found them moving again, the cattle lowing in protest at being driven before they'd properly rested. By mid-morning, the western hills had grown from distant shadows to defined forms, and Thomas began to recognize landmarks from previous journeys. "Should be just beyond that ridge," he said, pointing to a formation that resembled a sleeping buffalo. "There's a stand of cottonwoods that marks the spring." They crested the ridge an hour later, and Thomas felt his heart sink. The cottonwoods were there, but their leaves had yellowed prematurely, and the ground beneath them showed no signs of moisture. The spring had dried up. "What now?" Samuel asked, voicing the question written on all their faces. Thomas removed his hat, running fingers through his sweat-dampened hair. "We push on toward that valley," he decided, gesturing to a depression between 2 hills about 3 miles distant. "There might be another water source there. If not, we'll have to ration what we have and make straight for Green River." The detour had already cost them precious time and water. The cattle were growing more difficult to manage, their instincts driving them to search for water on their own. It took all 3 men to keep the herd together as they descended into the valley. It was then that Thomas spotted movement among a cluster of rocks, quick and deliberate, not the random scurrying of wildlife. He raised a hand, signaling the brothers to slow their pace. "Someone's watching us," he said quietly. Elijah's hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip. "Shoshone." "Most likely," Thomas replied. "Keep your hand away from that gun. We're on their land, and we're looking for water. Last thing we need is to appear threatening." Thomas urged Penny forward, separating himself slightly from the herd and the brothers. He removed his hat in a deliberate gesture of peace and raised his empty hand. "Hello," he called out. "We're just passing through, looking for water for our animals." For several long moments, there was no response. Then, a small figure emerged from behind the rocks. a boy, no more than 12 years old, dressed in buckskin leggings and a worn cotton shirt that had clearly been obtained through trade. His dark eyes were wary but curious as he regarded the cowboys and their cattle. Thomas remained still, allowing the boy to decide whether to approach or retreat. Behind him, he could hear the brothers muttering to each other, but thankfully staying put as instructed. The boy said something in his native tongue, pointing toward the cattle and then making a drinking motion with his hand. Thomas nodded, miming the same action. "Water," Thomas said clearly. "Do you know where we can find water?" The boy hesitated, then pointed deeper into the valley, making a flowing motion with his hand. He took a few steps in that direction, then stopped, clearly uncertain about leading strangers further into his territory. Thomas made a decision. He dismounted slowly, careful to make no sudden movements, and approached his saddlebag. The boy tensed but didn't flee. Thomas retrieved a small leather pouch and walked forward until he was about 10 feet from the boy. There, he knelt and emptied the contents of the pouch onto the ground. A handful of glass beads, a small brass bell, and a folding knife with a bone handle. "A gift," Thomas said, then backed away to his horse. The boy approached cautiously, examining the items with obvious interest. He picked up the knife, testing its edge with his thumb before tucking it into a small pouch at his waist. He left the other items on the ground, but gave Thomas a small nod. Then, with a gesture that conveyed both caution and invitation, he beckoned for Thomas to follow and began walking deeper into the valley. "Stay with the herd," Thomas told the brothers. "I'll be back." "You can't just go off with him alone," Elijah protested. "I can, and I will," Thomas replied firmly. "These people know every water source for 50 miles. Without their help, we might lose half the herd before reaching Green River." He patted Penny's neck. "If I'm not back by sundown, head east toward the main trail. You'll find water within a day's ride." Without waiting for further argument, Thomas began leading Penny after the boy, who had paused to wait for him a short distance away. As they walked, Thomas noticed details about the boy he had missed from afar. A scar along his forearm, the careful way he placed each foot to make minimal noise, the eagle feather tied into a thin braid behind his right ear. They walked for nearly half an hour, following a barely perceptible game trail that wound between rocky outcroppings and through patches of sage. Finally, the ground began to slope downward, and Thomas detected a change in the air, a subtle freshness that hinted at moisture. The boy stopped at the edge of a small depression ringed by willows. There, bubbling up from between rocks, was a spring, smaller than the one Thomas had originally sought, but flowing steadily, feeding a pool about 15 feet across before disappearing back into the ground. Thomas could not hide his relief. He smiled at the boy and made a sweeping gesture that encompassed his cattle in the distance. "May we bring our animals here?" he asked, knowing the boy probably wouldn't understand his words, but hoping his meaning was clear. The boy studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he pointed to the sun and made an arc with his finger from east to west, before pointing to the spring and making a pushing away motion. Thomas interpreted this as permission to use the spring, but an instruction to be gone by sunset. He nodded in agreement. "Thank you," he said, reaching for his canteen. "Would you like some water first?" The boy watched as Thomas filled his canteen, then stepped forward with unexpected boldness and took it when Thomas offered it. He drank deeply, then returned the canteen with the ghost of a smile. It was only as the boy turned to leave that Thomas noticed a pendant hanging from a cord around his neck, a small piece of polished turquoise set in silver. Something about it struck Thomas as familiar, tugging at a memory he couldn't quite place. "Wait," he called, though he knew the boy wouldn't understand. "What's your name?" The boy paused, seeming to consider the question despite the language barrier. He touched his chest. "Ahiga," he said clearly, then pointed at Thomas with a questioning expression. "Thomas," the cowboy replied, touching his own chest. "Thomas Miller." The boy nodded once, as if confirming something to himself, then turned and disappeared among the rocks with the silent efficiency that had marked his approach. Thomas stood alone by the spring for several minutes, replaying the encounter in his mind. There had been something in the boy's eyes, a wisdom beyond his years, mixed with a wariness that spoke of difficult experiences. Thomas wondered about the boy's family, his tribe, and what circumstances had led him to be alone in this remote valley. With a sigh, he filled his canteen and remounted Penny, heading back to where the brothers waited with the increasingly restless cattle. As he rode, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was somehow significant, that the boy called Ahiga would cross his path again. What Thomas couldn't possibly know was how soon that crossing would come, or how it would forever alter the course of both their lives. The cattle drank greedily from the spring, their parched bodies seeming to absorb the water before it could even reach their stomachs. Thomas, Elijah, and Samuel worked efficiently to ensure each animal had its fill without trampling the delicate ecosystem around the water source. They refilled their canteens and water barrels, careful to leave the spring as undisturbed as possible. "Boy must have taken a shine to you," Samuel remarked as they prepared to move the herd to a nearby grassy area for the night. "Ain't often Indians share their water sources with white men these days." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Might be his people don't know he's here. He seemed to be alone. Or it might be a trap," Elijah added, his hand never straying far from his revolver. "Could be warriors watching us right now, waiting till we're settled for the night. If they wanted to attack us, they wouldn't have shown us the water first," Thomas countered, though he understood the younger man's caution. Stories of violence on both sides had spread throughout the territory, each incident fueling the next in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. "All the same, we'll keep watches tonight and move on at first light, as we promised." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Thomas took the opportunity to wash away the trail dust that had accumulated on his skin and clothes. The cool water was a blessing after days of rationing, and he allowed himself the small luxury of soaking his bandana and draping it over the back of his neck. He was just pulling his boots back on when he sensed a presence. Looking up, he was surprised to see Ahiga standing a few yards away, watching him with that same curious expression. This time, however, the boy was not alone. Beside him stood an older man, perhaps in his 50s, with deep lines etched into his copper face and long hair streaked with gray. Thomas stood slowly, raising his empty hands in a gesture that had become second nature in these uncertain territories. "Evening," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Hope we haven't overstayed our welcome." The older man stepped forward, his bearing dignified despite the simplicity of his buckskin clothing. To Thomas's surprise, he spoke in heavily accented but understandable English. "My grandson says you trade fair," the man said, his dark eyes assessing Thomas with the wisdom of decades. "Says you offer gift before asking favor. This is good way." Thomas inclined his head respectfully. "Your grandson was kind to show me the water. My cattle and my men needed it badly." "I am called Many Horses," the older man said. "The boy is Ahiga, son of my daughter." "Thomas Miller," Thomas replied, then gestured toward the camp where Elijah and Samuel were visibly tensing at the sight of the two Native Americans. "And those are the Hayes brothers, who work with me." Many Horses followed his gaze and nodded once, acknowledging the others without expressing any desire to approach them. "You drive cattle north? To the Green River trading post first, then further north to Fort Bridger," Thomas confirmed. "Been making this drive for several years now." Many Horses was silent for a moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind. "Things change," he finally said. "New soldiers at Fort. New rules about where Shoshone can hunt, where we can camp." There was no mistaking the bitterness that colored these words, though the man's expression remained impassive. Thomas nodded, understanding the unspoken message. The latest treaty had pushed the Shoshone even further from their traditional lands, confining them to areas that could barely sustain their way of life. "I'm sorry for that," he said, knowing the words were inadequate but feeling compelled to offer them anyway. Many Horses made a dismissive gesture. Word from one man changed nothing. "But grandson says you have honest eyes. Maybe you carry message to Fort." Thomas hesitated. Acting as a messenger between the Shoshone and the military could be seen as taking sides in a conflict he had thus far managed to navigate neutrally. Yet refusing seemed both dishonorable and unwise, given their vulnerable position. "What message?" he asked carefully. "Our people wish to meet with blue coat leaders when moon is full," many horses explained. "To speak of hunting grounds near Wind River. We send runners, but soldiers shoot before words are spoken." The old man's expression hardened momentarily before returning to its stoic mask. "You tell them many horses of eastern Shoshone seeks peaceful talk. No weapons, just words." Thomas considered this. Delivering such a message wasn't inherently dangerous, and if it could potentially prevent violence, he could hardly refuse. "I'll tell them," he agreed, "but I can't guarantee they'll listen." Many horses nodded, seemingly satisfied. Man can only carry words, cannot force others to hear. He reached into a small pouch at his waist and withdrew something, extending his closed fist toward Thomas. "For safe journey." Thomas held out his hand, and many horses dropped a small object into his palm, a polished stone bead of deep blue, intricately carved with a pattern of flowing water. It was clearly old and valuable, the kind of item passed down through generations. "I can't accept this," Thomas said, trying to return the gift. "It's too valuable." Many horses closed Thomas's fingers over the bead. Water shared freely is remembered. Debt must be balanced. With that, he turned to leave, gesturing for Ahiga to follow. The boy lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting Thomas's with an expression that seemed oddly conflicted for one so young. Then, in halting English that surprised the cowboy, Ahiga spoke. "My father was like you," he said carefully, as if retrieving long-unused words. "Cowboy." Before soldiers came, before Thomas could respond to this unexpected revelation, Ahiga turned and followed his grandfather, both figures soon disappearing into the gathering dusk as silently as they had appeared. Thomas stood motionless, the blue bead clutched in his hand, trying to make sense of Ahiga's parting words. The boy was mixed blood, half white, half Shoshone, a heritage that would place him in a difficult position in both worlds. It explained the familiar quality Thomas had sensed in him, the way he straddled two different realities. "Everything all right?" Samuel called from the camp, his voice edged with concern. Thomas pocketed the blue bead and walked back toward the others. "Fine," he replied. "Just been asked to deliver a message when we reach the fort." Elijah frowned. "We ain't getting involved in Indian affairs, are we?" "Bad for business, Tom. It's just delivering words. Nothing more," Thomas said firmly. "Words that might prevent bloodshed. I call that good for everyone's business." He began checking the cattle, effectively ending the conversation, though he could feel the brothers exchanging glances behind his back. That night, as he took the middle watch under a sky brilliant with stars, Thomas found himself turning Many Horse's blue bead over in his fingers, feeling its smooth contours and thinking about Ahiga. The boy's revelation about his father explained his tentative English and perhaps his willingness to help strangers. Thomas wondered what had happened to the man, whether he had abandoned his native family and returned to white society, or if perhaps he had died in one of the many conflicts that plagued the territories. Thomas had known other men who had taken native wives, some treating the arrangement as temporary while others committed fully to their new families. The children of such unions often found themselves caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. It was a hard path, especially in times of increasing tension between settlers and tribes. As dawn approached, casting the first pale light over the eastern horizon, Thomas made a decision. After delivering the cattle and Many Horses' message, he would seek out more information about Ahiga and his father. Perhaps there was some way he could help ease the boy's path, some connection he could make that would benefit him in the difficult years ahead. It was a small thing, perhaps, but the image of those solemn young eyes stayed with him as he roused the brothers and began preparations for breaking camp. Sometimes, Thomas reflected, the smallest gestures could ripple outward in ways no one could predict, like a single drop of water creating circles that expanded far beyond their humble origin. The trading post at Green River was a bustling center of commerce when Thomas and the Hayes brothers arrived 3 days later. The settlement had grown considerably since Thomas's last visit, with new wooden structures sprouting alongside the original trading post and a steady stream of wagons, riders, and pedestrians moving through what was evolving into a proper main street. "Place has changed," Thomas remarked as they guided the cattle toward the holding pens at the eastern edge of town. "Twice the size it was last summer. Railroad surveyors came through last month," Samuel informed him, having overheard the information from another traveler on the trail. "Talk as they might run a line through here within 2 years." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. The railroad's inexorable advance was transforming the West with each passing season, bringing settlers, supplies, and soldiers with increasing efficiency. It meant prosperity for some and displacement for others, particularly the native tribes whose territories were bisected by the iron rails and whose resources were consumed by the newcomers they brought. After securing the cattle and arranging for their care, the three men made their way to Donovan's saloon, an establishment Thomas had frequented on previous drives. The familiar smell of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies greeted them as they pushed through the bat-wing doors, along with the din of conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. They found a table in the corner, and Elijah went to fetch drinks while Thomas surveyed the room. Many of the faces were unfamiliar, but he recognized a few fellow cattlemen and traders. What caught his attention, however, was a group of soldiers seated near the bar, cavalry, judging by their uniforms, and likely stationed at the ford upriver. Quite a few military boys in town, Thomas observed when Elijah returned with 3 glasses and a bottle of whiskey. "Heard there was trouble with some Shoshone hunters last week," Elijah replied, keeping his voice low. "Army's been patrolling heavier since then." Thomas frowned slightly, recalling many horses' words about soldiers shooting before listening. He wondered if that incident was what the old man had been referring to. Their business at Green River was straightforward: sell half the herd to the local butcher who supplied the growing settlement and the numerous travelers passing through. The transaction went smoothly the following morning, with Thomas negotiating a fair price that satisfied both parties. With their saddlebags heavier with coin and their responsibilities temporarily lightened, the men prepared to continue north with the remaining cattle. It was while purchasing supplies for the next leg of their journey that Thomas encountered the first complications related to his promise to many horses. He was selecting bags of coffee beans at the general store when a voice called his name. "Tom Miller. Thought that was you I saw riding in yesterday." Thomas turned to find Marshal Jenkins approaching, a wide smile beneath his bushy mustache. Jenkins was a former Army scout who had settled in Green River years ago and now worked as a liaison between the military and local traders. "Marshal," Thomas greeted him with a handshake. "Good to see you're still keeping this place in line." Jenkins chuckled, trying to, though it gets harder with every new face that steps off a wagon. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Speaking of new faces, heard you came in from the south. Any trouble on the trail?" Thomas hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Jenkins had always been fair in his dealings, but his primary loyalties lay with the Army and the settlers. "Nothing unusual," Thomas replied carefully. "Droughts made water scarce, but we managed." Jenkins studied him for a moment, his experienced eyes detecting the omission. "Ran into some Indians, did you?" Seeing no point in denying it, Thomas nodded. "Met a Shoshone elder and his grandson. They showed us a spring when our water was running low. Decent people." Jenkins mused, stroking his mustache. "Would that have been near the western foothills? Area they call Eagle Valley?" "Might have been," Thomas admitted, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Didn't catch the name of the place." Jenkins leaned closer. "Tom, I'm saying this as a friend. The Army's got specific orders about unauthorized contact with the Shoshone right now. There's talk of some bands refusing to stay in their designated areas, causing trouble for settlers. The only trouble I saw was a drought that was killing my cattle," Thomas countered, his voice hardening slightly. "And a Shoshone boy who helped us when he didn't have to." Jenkins raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not accusing you of anything. Just warning you that Captain Hollister over at Fort Bridger isn't as understanding as some of his predecessors. Man sees the world in black and white, and right now, all Indians are in the black category as far as he's concerned." Thomas absorbed this information with growing concern. If the new captain was as rigid as Jenkins suggested, delivering many horses' message about a peaceful meeting might be more complicated than anticipated. "Appreciate the warning," Thomas said finally. "I'll keep my head down." Jenkins clapped him on the shoulder. "Always knew you were sensible. Stop by the office before you head out. I've got some maps of the northern trails that might save you some time." After Jenkins departed, Thomas completed his purchases with a troubled mind. The additional information made his promise to many horses seem increasingly fraught with potential complications, yet he couldn't bring himself to abandon it entirely. The blue bead weighed in his pocket like a physical reminder of his commitment. That evening, as they enjoyed what would be their last hot meal before the trail, Thomas shared Jenkins' warning with the Hayes brothers. "So we're just forgetting about the Indians' message, right?" Elijah asked, clearly relieved at the prospect. Thomas took a slow sip of his coffee. "Not exactly. I gave my word." Samuel, who had been quietly listening, leaned forward. "Tom, you're talking about getting between the army and the Indians. That's no place for a cattleman to stand." "I'm not standing anywhere," Thomas clarified. "I'm just passing along a request for peaceful talk. What the army does with that information is their business. And if this Captain Hollister decides you're too friendly with the wrong people," Elijah pressed, "could lose more than just a business opportunity." Thomas understood their concerns. In the current climate, even the appearance of sympathy toward native tribes could brand a man as untrustworthy in the eyes of settlers and soldiers alike. Yet the image of Ahiga's solemn face remained vivid in his mind, along with the boy's quietly delivered revelation about his father. "I'll be careful," Thomas assured them, "but I won't break my word, not when it might prevent bloodshed." The brothers exchanged glances but offered no further argument. They had worked with Thomas long enough to recognize when his mind was set. Later that night, unable to sleep despite the comfort of a real bed at the town's small hotel, Thomas stepped outside onto the porch. The main street was mostly quiet, with only a few lights burning in windows and the occasional sound of laughter or music drifting from the saloon. He was about to return inside when movement in the shadows across the street caught his attention. A figure detached itself from the darkness and moved purposefully toward him. Thomas tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt, but then recognition dawned as the figure stepped into a pool of light cast by a nearby window. It was Ahiga. The boy wore different clothing now, faded denim trousers and a cotton shirt that might have belonged to a white settler's child, though he still wore the turquoise pendant around his neck. He glanced nervously up and down the street before approaching the porch. "What are you doing here?" Thomas asked in a hushed voice, amazed to see the boys so far from where they had met. "It's not safe for you to be in town alone." Ahiga's expression was grave. "Grandfather sent me. Soldiers came after you left. 3 men with blue coats and guns." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Was anyone hurt?" Ahiga shook his head. "They took food, blankets. Said our people must go to reservation now, or soldiers will come back. Burn everything." His voice remained steady, but Thomas could see the fear and anger in his eyes. "Grandfather says message more important now. Meeting must happen, or there will be fighting." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, weighing his options. The situation had clearly escalated since his departure from the spring. If soldiers were already confronting the Shoshone directly, time was running short for any peaceful resolution. "How did you find me?" he asked, still struggling to understand how the boy had tracked him to Green River. A ghost of a smile crossed Ahiga's face. "Followed cattle. Not hard." The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. "Must be careful. Man at store watches for Indians in town." Thomas knew he meant Jenkins, which complicated matters further. If the former scouts spotted Ahiga, questions would be asked that Thomas couldn't easily answer. "Where are you staying?" Thomas asked. "Outside town," Ahiga replied with a vague gesture. "In trees by river." Thomas made a quick decision. "There's a stable behind this building. Wait for me there. I'll bring you some food." Ahiga nodded and melted back into the shadows with the same silent efficiency Thomas had observed at their first meeting. Moving as casually as possible, Thomas re-entered the hotel and gathered some bread, cheese, and dried beef from his supplies. He waited until he was certain no one was watching before slipping out the back door toward the stable. He found Ahiga waiting patiently in an empty stall, his small form nearly invisible in the darkness. The boy accepted the food with murmured thanks and began eating with the deliberate slowness of someone accustomed to making scarce resources last. "I'll deliver your grandfather's message," Thomas assured him as he watched the boy eat. "But it might not change anything. This new captain doesn't sound like a man who's eager to negotiate." Ahiga paused, considering this. "Grandfather says words must be tried before arrows." Always. The wisdom in the statement, delivered so matter-of-factly by a child, struck Thomas deeply. "Your grandfather is right," he acknowledged, "and I'll do what I can to make sure his words are heard." As Ahiga finished eating, Thomas came to another decision. "It's not safe for you to stay here or travel alone. When we leave tomorrow with the remaining cattle, you should come with us. I can get you closer to Fort Bridger, where your grandfather wants to meet." Ahiga studied him with those penetrating dark eyes that seemed to see more than a boy his age should. "Why do you help?" he asked simply. Thomas found himself unprepared for the directness of the question. He thought about mentioning his debt for the water or his general desire to prevent conflict, but in the end, honesty seemed the only appropriate response. "Because you reminded me that there are people caught in the middle of these troubles," he said quietly. "People who didn't choose which world they were born into, but have to find their way through both." Something shifted in Ahiga's expression, a recognition, perhaps, that Thomas understood more than he had initially revealed. The boy nodded once, decisively. "I will come," he said, "but we must be careful. Soldiers watch trails." "We'll be careful," Thomas promised. "Get some rest now. We leave at dawn." As he returned to his room, Thomas was acutely aware that he had just significantly complicated an already precarious situation. Harboring a Shoshone boy and agreeing to facilitate a meeting that the army might view as unauthorized could have serious consequences for him and the Hayes brothers. Yet looking back at the stable where Ahiga, now, slept among the hay, Thomas couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Some paths revealed themselves one step at a time, and all a man could do was walk them with as much integrity as he could muster, regardless of where they might lead. Dawn broke with a brilliance that painted the eastern sky in hues of pink and gold, casting long shadows across Green River as Thomas and the Hayes brothers prepared to depart. Thomas had risen earlier than usual to check on Ahiga, finding the boy already awake and alert in the stable. "Stay hidden in the wagon until we're clear of town," Thomas instructed, indicating the supply wagon that accompanied their cattle drive. "Once we're on the open trail, you can ride with me." Ahiga nodded, his expression solemn. "Many eyes here. I stay quiet." Thomas helped the boy climb into the wagon and concealed him beneath a tarp among the supplies. It wasn't an ideal arrangement, but it would have to suffice until they were safely away from the settlement and any watchful eyes that might question the presence of Shoshone youth among their party. The Hayes brothers were already leading the reduced herd toward the northern trail when Thomas joined them, taking his position at the rear of the formation. Samuel gave him a questioning look, clearly having noticed his delayed arrival, but Thomas merely shrugged as if he'd been attending to some minor personal business. Their departure from Green River proceeded without incident, the town gradually receding behind them as they followed the well-worn trail that paralleled the river. It wasn't until they were several miles north, with no other travelers in sight, that Thomas fell back to the supply wagon and signaled for Ahiga to emerge. The boy climbed out with the agility of a squirrel, stretching limbs that had grown stiff in the confined space. Without needing instruction, he approached Penny, who regarded him with curious eyes, but remained calm as Thomas lifted Ahiga onto the saddle in front of him. It was only then that Elijah noticed the addition to their party. He reined his horse sharply, turning to face Thomas with an expression of disbelief. "What in God's name is he doing here?" he demanded, loud enough for Samuel to hear and turn as well. Thomas had anticipated this reaction and kept his voice calm and measured. "This is Ahiga, the boy who showed us the spring. He found me in Green River last night with news that soldiers have been threatening his people. I'm helping him get back to his grandfather. Have you lost your mind?" Elijah's face had flushed red beneath his tan. If Jenkins or any of those soldiers spot us with an Indian boy, they'll assume we're involved in whatever trouble's brewing. He's just a child, Thomas countered, and he's half white. His father was a cowboy. Samuel, who had ridden closer to assess the situation, spoke up. That won't matter to the army, Tom. You know that. His tone was less confrontational than his brother's, but equally concerned. Thomas met their gazes steadily. I gave my word to deliver a message. Ahiga can help make sure it reaches the right people. Once that's done, we can continue on our way. Your word to some Indians is going to get us all arrested, or worse, Elijah spat. I didn't sign on for this. No, you signed on to help me drive cattle, Thomas replied, his patience beginning to wear thin. Which is what we're doing. What happens between here and Fort Bridger doesn't change that. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group, broken only by the lowing of cattle and the creak of leather saddles. Finally, Samuel sighed. What exactly is your plan here, Tom? We can't just ride into Fort Bridger with him. Thomas nodded, acknowledging the validity of the question. There's a trading post about a day's ride south of the fort. Ahiga says his grandfather and some other Shoshone elders will meet us there. I'll deliver the message, make the introductions if needed, and then we continue on to Fort Bridger with the rest of the herd. Simple as that. Elijah snorted derisively. Nothing's ever that simple when Indians are involved. Enough, Thomas said sharply. Decision's made. You're welcome to ride ahead if you don't want any part of it. But the boy stays with me until I fulfill my promise. The finality in his tone ended the discussion, if not the brothers' obvious disapproval. With visible reluctance, they returned to their positions, and the drive continued northward. Ahiga remained silent throughout the exchange, his body tense against Thomas's chest. Only when the brothers had ridden ahead did he speak, his voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the trail. They do not want me here. Thomas sighed. It's not about you, exactly. Things between white folks and Indians have gotten complicated, and they're worried about getting caught in the middle. Like me, Ahiga said with surprising insight. Caught in middle. Thomas glanced down at the boy, struck once again by the maturity in his young eyes. Yes, he acknowledged. I suppose like you. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of Penny's gait creating a soothing cadence beneath them. Eventually, curiosity got the better of Thomas. You said your father was a cowboy, he ventured. What happened to him? Ahiga was quiet for so long that Thomas thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a flatness that suggested he was reciting facts rather than expressing emotion. He worked cattle, met my mother when trading with Shoshone. They married in both ways, white man's church and Shoshone ceremony. Ahiga's fingers absently touched the turquoise pendant at his neck. He gave this to her, said blue stone is strong, like their love. Thomas waited, sensing there was more to the story. When I was 7 winters, soldiers came to valley where we lived. Said all Shoshone must go to new place, land set aside by great father in Washington. Ahiga's voice grew quieter. Father argued with bluecoats. Said his family had right to stay on land he'd bought. There was fighting. Father was shot. The stark simplicity of the statement belied the tragedy it contained. Thomas felt a heaviness settle in his chest, imagining the scene, a man defending his family, his way of life, cut down for standing his ground. I'm sorry, he said, knowing the words were inadequate. Ahiga's shoulders moved in a small shrug. Mother took me to her people after. Grandfather teaches me Shoshone ways, but also says I must learn white man's words, white man's thinking. Says I will need both to survive. Your grandfather is a wise man, Thomas observed. He says wisdom comes too late for most men, Ahiga replied. Says I must find mine early. They lapsed back into silence as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The trail led them through rolling hills covered in sage and occasional stands of aspen, their leaves fluttering like golden coins in the breeze. It was beautiful country, Thomas reflected, rich enough to sustain many people if they could only find a way to share it without bloodshed. By midday, they stopped to rest the cattle near a small stream. While the animals drank and grazed, Thomas shared his provisions with Ahiga, watching as the boy ate with the same deliberate care he had shown the previous night. "Your English is good," Thomas remarked. "Did your father teach you?" Ahiga nodded. "And missionary at trading post. I go there sometimes to learn reading." "That's good," Thomas said encouragingly. "Reading will open many doors for you." Ahiga considered this. "Grandfather says knowledge is like a weapon, can protect or harm, depending on who holds it." Before Thomas could respond, Samuel approached, his expression guarded but less hostile than earlier. "Cattle are rested," he reported. "We should move on if we want to make the ridge by nightfall." Thomas nodded and began packing away the remains of their meal. "Have you spotted any other travelers?" he asked, mindful of the need to avoid unwanted encounters while Ahiga was with them. "Just a supply wagon headed south about an hour back," Samuel replied. "No sign of military patrols." "Good. Let's keep our eyes open all the same." As they prepared to resume their journey, Thomas noticed Ahiga staring intently at something in the distance. Following the boy's gaze, he spotted a plume of dust rising above the hills to the west, too large to be a single rider or even a small group. "What is it?" Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Soldiers," Ahiga said grimly. "Many horses." Thomas quickly assessed their options. The trail offered little cover, and changing course would mean losing valuable time. If the dust indeed signaled a cavalry patrol, their best hope was to continue normally and pray the soldiers had other business that would take them in a different direction. "Mount up," he instructed, helping Ahiga back on a penny. "We'll keep the trail, but pick up the pace. With luck, they'll pass well behind us." For the next hour, Thomas kept one eye on the western horizon as they drove the cattle northward. The dust cloud initially appeared to be moving parallel to their route, but gradually it began to angle toward the trail ahead of them. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that an intersection was inevitable. "They're going to cut across our path," Samuel observed, riding back to confer with Thomas. "Might be best if the boy stays out of sight when they do." Thomas nodded grimly. "The wagon's too obvious a hiding place if they decide to search us." He scanned their surroundings, seeking alternatives. About a quarter-mile to the east, a rocky outcropping rose from the plain, offering potential shelter. "There," he decided. "I'll take him to those rocks and rejoin you after the soldiers pass." Elijah, who had joined them, frowned. "And if they stop to talk? How do we explain where you've gone?" "Tell them I'm scouting ahead for water," Thomas replied. "It's believable enough with the drought." Without waiting for further discussion, Thomas directed Penny toward the outcropping, feeling Ahiga tense against him as they separated from the herd. They reached the rocks quickly, dismounting in the shadow of a large boulder that shielded them from the trail. "Stay here," Thomas instructed, leading Ahiga to a natural hollow within the formation. "No matter what happens, don't show yourself until I come back for you." "Understand." Ahiga nodded solemnly. "I understand." Thomas hesitated, suddenly reluctant to leave the boy alone. "I won't be long," he promised, then turned to remount Penny. "Thomas," Ahiga called softly, using his full name for the first time. When Thomas looked back, the boy touched his chest in a gesture that mirrored their first introduction. "Thank you." Something in the simple sincerity of the words touched Thomas deeply. He nodded once, unable to formulate an adequate response, then rode back toward the trail. He had nearly reached the herd when the cavalry patrol came into view, 12 riders in blue uniforms, moving at a steady trot along a path that would intersect the trail about 100 yards ahead of the cattle. Thomas slowed Penny to a walk, observing the soldiers from distance. To his dismay, the patrol leader raised a hand, signaling his men to halt as they spotted the cattle drive. After a brief exchange, the entire group altered course to approach the herd directly. Samuel met Thomas's eyes across the distance, his expression conveying clear concern. There was nothing to do now but face the encounter and hope for the best. As Thomas rode up to join the Hayes brothers, the cavalry patrol reached the trail. At their head was a lieutenant, young but carrying himself with the stiff formality of a recent West Point graduate. He raised a hand in greeting that was more command than courtesy. "Afternoon," the lieutenant called. "Where are you men headed?" "Fort Bridger," Thomas replied, keeping his voice casual. "Delivering cattle for the garrison." The lieutenant nodded. seemingly satisfied with this answer. Seen any Indian activity on the trail? We're tracking a group of Shoshone reported to be moving through this area. They've refused relocation orders. Thomas felt a chill at the description, wondering if the group in question included many horses and his people. Haven't seen any Indians, he replied truthfully, since Ahiga was safely hidden among the rocks. Trail's been quiet except for a supply wagon headed south. The lieutenant studied him for a moment, then glanced at the Hayes brothers and the cattle beyond. You men coming for Green River? That's right, Samuel confirmed. Left this morning. Any trouble there? Elijah shook his head. Town's peaceful enough. Growing fast, though. The lieutenant seemed about to move on when one of his sergeants spurred his horse forward, leaning in to speak in a low voice. The officer's expression changed subtly as he listened, his gaze returning to Thomas with new scrutiny. One of my men says he recognizes you, the lieutenant said. Says you were asking questions about the Shoshone in Green River. That true? Thomas silently cursed his luck. One of the soldiers must have overheard his conversation with Jenkins or seen him somewhere in town. I asked about trail conditions, he replied carefully. Natural to want to know if there's any trouble ahead. The sergeant who had spoken to the lieutenant moved his horse closer. You were talking to Marshal Jenkins at the general store. He specifically warned you about unauthorized contact with the Shoshone. Thomas maintained his composure, though he could feel the situation deteriorating rapidly. Jenkins is an old acquaintance. We exchanged news, as men do. Nothing more to it than that. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. I think we'll have a look at your wagon and supplies, just to be thorough. Sergeant, take 2 men and search their equipment. Thomas's heart sank as 3 soldiers dismounted and approached the supply wagon. The Hayes brothers watched with barely concealed anxiety, though there was nothing to find there. The real concern was whether the soldiers would expand their search to the surrounding area. As the search proceeded, Thomas kept his expression neutral despite the tension coiling in his stomach. If they discovered Ahiga, the consequences would be severe, not just for Thomas, but for the boy as well. Children were sometimes separated from their tribes and sent to distant schools in the East, supposedly for their education, but effectively severing their connections to their heritage and families. The sergeant returned after a few minutes, shaking his head. Nothing unusual, Lieutenant. Just typical trail supplies. The lieutenant seemed disappointed, but nodded. Very well. You men can continue on your way. But I advise you to report any Indian sightings immediately. These Shoshone are in violation of treaty agreements and considered hostile. We'll keep that in mind, Thomas assured him, eager to end the encounter. The lieutenant gave a curt nod and was about to signal his men to move out when his gaze fell on something that made him pause. That's an interesting piece, he said, pointing to Thomas's saddlebag where the blue bead many horses had given him was partially visible, having apparently worked its way out during the ride. Before Thomas could react, the lieutenant urged his horse forward and plucked the bead from the saddlebag, examining it closely. This is Shoshone work, he stated flatly, looking up at Thomas with undisguised suspicion. Where did you get it? Thomas knew that any lie would only deepen the officer's distrust. It was a gift, he admitted, from a Shoshone elder several years ago in exchange for some tobacco. I've carried it as a good luck charm since then. The lieutenant's expression hardened. A likely story. He pocketed the bead and turned to his sergeant. I think Mr. Miller here knows more than he's telling us. We'll escort these men to Fort Bridger, where they can explain themselves more fully to Captain Hollister. Thomas felt a surge of alarm. Being taken to the fort under escort would not only delay his meeting with many horses, but would leave Ahiga stranded and alone in unfamiliar territory. That's unnecessary, Lieutenant, he protested. We're headed to the fort anyway with these cattle. There's no need for an escort. I'll be the judge of what's necessary, the lieutenant replied coldly. Sergeant, position 4 men behind them, 4 on each flank. We'll proceed to the fort directly. As the soldiers moved to surround the cattle drive, Thomas exchanged grim looks with the Hayes brothers. They were effectively prisoners now, unable to return for Ahiga without revealing his presence and confirming the lieutenant's suspicions. What about the boy? Samuel murmured as they prepared to move out. Thomas glanced toward the distant rocks where a Higa remained hidden. "He's smart and capable," he replied quietly. "He'll have to make his own way back to his people." The thought of abandoning the boy tore at him, but there seemed no alternative that wouldn't put a Higa in greater danger. Thomas could only hope that the boy's survival skills and knowledge of the territory would see him safely reunited with his grandfather. As the cattle drive resumed under military escort, Thomas found himself praying that this would not be the last chapter in his unexpected connection with a Higa and many horses. The blue bead might be lost, but the promise it represented remained, a commitment to carry words of peace across the divide that separated two worlds increasingly at odds. What Thomas couldn't know, as they moved steadily northward under the watchful eyes of the cavalry, was that fate had not finished weaving the threads that bound their stories together. Ahead lay Fort Bridger and whatever reception Captain Hollister would provide, but also opportunities and dangers that none of them could yet imagine. The path to understanding between peoples was rarely straight or easy, Thomas reflected as he urged Penny forward. It twisted and turned like a mountain trail, sometimes doubling back on itself, sometimes seeming to disappear entirely. But perhaps that was why the journey was worth undertaking, because the destination, however elusive, promised something beyond mere survival. It offered the possibility of a world where water could be shared freely across the boundaries that divided humanity, where words might still prevail over weapons, and where a boy caught between cultures might find solid ground on which to build a future.